working as a pundit, getting paid to do so.
There is that.
There is that. So yes, I'm hopefully we need more analysis, Dave. More older ex-managers.
24 hours a day.
24 hours a day, but pay more because the people want to see it. Five or six conversations a season. That was it. And usually it was if you weren't playing very well. You very rarely...
The curly finger got you in the office.
Exactly. And that's when you probably had a little bit of time with a manager, because it just was a little bit different then. And watch a game back and look at the halftime analysis and look at... I think you have to be careful as a player, manager, coach. You know, I think you have to be very careful that you don't take that outside opinion too far and too much to heart. I think, you know, some people will listen to that and watch it back and try to dissect what they want to dissect and what they think can help them.
Welcome, football fans, to Breaking Lines, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the beautiful game like never before. I'm Gary Rowett, former player and manager, joined by the insightful Dave Carolan, a man with his finger on the pulse of football's beating heart. Together, Dave and I bring you unrivaled insight, context, and a few stories from the trenches. Join us as we dissect the game, break down the plays, and explore the intricate dance between managers, players, fans, and the beautiful game itself. This is Breaking Lines, where the game is more than just a match.
Well, here we go. Season 2, we're kicking off with a big topic. Is there too much analysis? Are we getting to the point now where a player or a manager or a team can't do anything without it being hyper-analysed? What's your thoughts on that?
Two different thoughts, really. I think my first thought is that working as a pundit, getting paid to do so.
There is that.
There is that. So, yes, I'm hopefully... we need more analysis, Dave. More older ex-managers.
24 hours a day.
24 hours a day, but pay more because the people want to see it now. Look, I think what it shows is it shows how popular football is. I think it shows how the sport has grown, both from outside investment to the coverage of it by lots and lots of different media outlets, to the interest of it from the fans. You know, I think it's just absolutely gone exponentially through the roof, hasn't it? I mean, if you think about it, when we were, you know, I don't want to hark back too far, but when we were sort of younger, I suppose, you know, you might have had match of the day and just some highlights, and that was more or less it. You know, Gazzetta Italia on Channel 4 on a
Lazio. Let's go.
But you didn't have a lot, did you? You didn't have a lot, and you know, and so now I think it's changed the way people view football. I think it's changed the knowledge of the fan to a certain degree. I think it's made things tougher for someone involved in the game, you know, at the sort of base level, you know, stood on the touchline under pressure, whether that's a member of staff or whether that's a, you know, not just a manager, head coach, whether that's a director of football, whether that's a CEO, whether that's a head of analysis, head of medical, head of performance. I think that pressure's only ramped up because, you know, everything is being analysed to the nth degree.
And that makes a challenge, isn't it? Like, you only have to sit and watch a live game that's on the TV, and at halftime you may have people like yourself or ex-players or people who've been in management who are almost second-guessing what you should do for the second half, the changes you should make, the tactical tweaks that you should embrace before you come out for the second half. And if you don't do them, it's almost in the studio, it's nice and cold, and it's you're not under the pressure of making the decisions that you have to inside the dressing room. But if you don't do almost what they do or what they suggest, then are you criticised then for not making the changes that they think?
Yeah, look, I think first and foremost, you understand the role of the pundit, the analyst, whatever you might call it, the commentator, you know, the ex-pro on co-coms. You know, you understand that they've got a job to do, just like you've got a job to do, and their job is to give information and opinion on the game. And of course, it'd be a very poor coverage of a match if at halftime everyone said, well, it's easy for us to sit here and say what we think he should do. Well, of course, that's what you're paid to do. So you have to give an opinion. Sometimes when you're at the coal face, shall we speak, that opinion feels a little bit easier to give, like you say, when you're sat in a nice studio and you've had the benefit of seeing the first half play out or the second half play out or the whole game play out. So I think it's very different. I think when you've been on both sides, you understand both roles and how very different they are. What I think is different now and I think is a big challenge for any manager, is the fact that, the fans are watching these insights and people outside the game or who are maybe not at the game are watching these insights. And I think that's really, really putting a lot more pressure on a manager or staff, because, it's easy for people to see after a game what you maybe should have done or an opinion of what you should have done. And of course, that becomes the narrative, particularly if you lose, that becomes a narrative. And, now it's dissected in so many different ways, that narrative's easy for people to follow.
And that is the challenge, is that before you've even got to your coach's room after a game, it's already been absolutely analysed to an inch of its death by people online, but in the studio. So the narrative is already being formed around the game. Obviously, there's the result and there's the performance. Everybody can witness that. But it's now starting to tell the story around the game before you've even got to do your press conference. Almost the headlines are already written, they're already out there. It's on a website somewhere what the analysis of the game is, the player ratings, the coach's rating. That's got to be a long way from when you started. What was it like, say, when you started out early in the days? Like, was it just like a videotape that you used to get to watch your game back? Was there any kind of analysis going on?
Yeah, I think as a player back in the day, like the only real feedback, if you like, was from the manager or the coaches after games, in the week. But that wasn't an awful lot, because often as a manager, you might have spoke to the manager probably 5 or 6 conversations a season. That was it. And usually it was if you weren't playing very well. You very rarely...
The curly finger got you in the office.
Exactly. And that's when you probably had a little bit of time with a manager, because it just was a little bit different then. You were expected to almost manage yourself and analyse your own performance rather than think about other people doing it. You would get a videotape of your clips so that you could watch them back maybe and get a little bit of feedback that way. But again, you were still evaluating that yourself. Now as a Premier League footballer, you could essentially, like put Match of the Day on or put Sky on and watch a game back and look at the halftime analysis and I think you have to be careful as a player, manager, coach. I think you have to be very careful that you don't take that outside opinion too far and too much to heart. I think, some people will listen to that and watch it back and try to dissect what they want to dissect and what they think can help them. Some people won't want to listen to that at all, because it's like anything, isn't it? It's let's say you're getting negative feedback from people that don't see your work every day. They don't see your work every hour. They don't understand your character necessarily. They don't really know what makes you tick and your history and your background. So it's very difficult to take on board too much information from people that don't work with you every day. So I think it's up to you how you see that. And I think also as a fan, it's difficult, isn't it? But I think it's also dangerous as a fan if you only ever look at the information given to you by people that are paid to almost critique performance. I think that's also dangerous as well. I think most or a lot of fans would have a slightly more balanced view. Some wouldn't, so it's like anything. Some players, some fans, some members of staff would take it in different ways. And I think you have to work out yourself which analysis, you want to listen to or you think is the most helpful to your performance or your team's performance. I think that's the important bit. How do you think players take that nowadays? You've obviously worked closely with players, and how do you think they find that information after a game or the information from, does that affect them in your opinion?
Well, it's amazing because now they can come straight in after the game, and by the time you finish speaking to them, they can go straight onto the phone. They can see all of the stats. It's literally there for them live through the various app providers. They can find out absolutely their pass completion rates and how many threatening balls that they attempted in a game. So straight away, they're able to almost self-reflect on their own performance. Obviously, 25 years ago, there was one videotape, and that tended to go to the manager, and you would never see it again. There were limited highlights on TV. Players are pretty switched on nowadays, aren't they? They know very quickly on their technical stats. By that evening, they've probably got a video breakdown of their game already, compartmentalized into different constituent parts of whatever they do. So they're already ruminating on their own performance. They've formed a view. So even by the time they get into training ground, whether it's the following day or 2 days later, they've already, self-analyzed. Then it's probably about the contextual conversation that they have with you as a manager as to how they were supposed to play in the game, and maybe how they can improve on that, or how they should potentially do things different going forward. But I think players are 100% used now to finding information out from whatever source that might be. And that obviously means we have a slightly different challenge at times, which is which source of information is the version of the truth that we're all going to ascribe to. Like, for example, you've got video. Obviously, video tends to tell you most things. It doesn't tell you everything, but what way does a manager, do you rely on video first? Do you rely on the stats? Is it a technical report, a tactical report, or do you have to put it all together?
Yeah, I mean, first, it's a really important point that you make, that, it doesn't tell the story completely. And I think that's the thing with data, isn't it? If we're talking about that type of analysis, I remember back to when I first started playing, or very early on in my career when I was at Derby County, and we had Steve McLaren was the coach there, and Steve introduced Prozone, which at the time was cutting edge. You'd sit there in the chairs, you'd be getting there'd be a massage.
Animations.
There'd be a massage chair while they'd have, a big screen in front of you, and they'd put different forms of data on there.
I think that was part of the upsell of Prozone. They gave you the massage chair so you sat in that and got nice and comfortable. And then the video.
I used to try and get out of that because they used to do it before training, and to be honest with you, by the time you were at training, you felt like you was asleep. Honestly, it was ridiculous. It just didn't help. Well, it might have been. And I remember Steve pulling me once after one of these sessions and saying, we just played Man United at Old Trafford, and back then, of course, even the coaches probably didn't quite know how to use that data effectively, but. And it was only early data, so it only told you a certain thing. But I remember Steve pulling me and saying, look at your pass completion. It was like 65% or something. You've only made maybe 30 passes. I mean, it was quite high for me. I was quite pleased with that.
Good
before you say that. And I think Pallister and Bruce at the time, theirs is 95%. They've made like 100 passes. And I said, Steve, I understand that you're going to use that as a tool to maybe see where you need to go professionally with your career, and maybe there's a lot of improvement to be made. I said, but it's very different judging my data to the two Man United centre-halves. They've got 6 or 7 players all wanting the ball, and we're sat off them. So they've got absolutely no pressure most of the time. So their stats are going to look far better and far more impressive, and they're at home. We're sat off. So every time I get the ball, we're getting pressed every single time by, I think, Andy Cole and Dwight York at the time. And I've got hardly anyone wanting the ball. So it's a very different context. It's a different challenge, and it's a different context to the way the stats appear. Now, that's just an example, but I think it's a good example of how stats can be misleading if you don't have the right context. And now there's different companies producing different stats. Actually, I think are far more game friendly, player friendly. I think tell a better story of what it is, rather than just how many touches you've made, how many passes have you made. But I think players now have a far better understanding of those stats and a far better way of maybe not a far better way of using them, but they'll use them nonetheless. I mean, I remember Matt Smith at Millwall, like Smudge was a really intelligent guy. We both say it, probably one of the most articulate and intelligent players that we've worked with.
It's a limited race, that one. Yes.
Yes. It's not a great league table, is it? But
no.
but he was really bright, and he'd come up to your office, and let's say I was leaving him out for a game that I didn't think suited him. Perhaps maybe we're away from home against a really tough possession-based team, and I just felt we needed a little bit more mobility to get after teams. And he had a great skill set, didn't he? But still effective now. At Salford, he's scoring a number of goals, having a great season. But Smudge would come up, and you could say whatever you wanted to him, but he'd already be armed with all the information. He'd had a much better memory than I did, by the way. So he'd go, well, whenever I've scored or whenever I've started, we've only lost one game in the last 20, and you'd be sat there going, in your head, you'd be thinking, really? How am I going to justify this one? Yeah, but it's not you, it's me, Smudge. So, but what the point I'm making is, you have to be very careful nowadays as well, as a head coach, manager, because ultimately the players have that information, and the players will, seek that information. They'll collate it themselves. They'll utilise that. Some players are not interested in the stats and don't care, but you know what it's like. They don't want to look at them. You can send them the stats through Saturday night, Sunday morning, and they're not going to read them. Whereas there's other players who want to utilise the stats to improve. And there's no right or wrong, but I think it's certainly a tool that I would like to have or if I was still playing, I would certainly like to have the data that's available to a player now.
Well, a Sunday morning where, you're waiting for a player to text you to say, where are my stats? Versus some of the players who, even when you send them to them, you don't even get an emoji, a thumbs up saying like, thanks for that. But they are ready now to receive them, and they're expecting of them. So I suppose we have to go to them now and make sure that they are serviced with that. And of course, we've got bigger departments now, haven't we? We've got analysis departments, which are no longer just a part-time coach who's having to, file his way through some video and pull out the clips. You might have 3, 4, 5 people in the department who are able to pull that all together. How does that get presented to you as a manager then? So will you get stuff straight after the game, or are you getting more details, information reports in the following 24, 48 hours? How does that layer itself up?
Yeah, I think so. I think first and foremost, you have an overview of statistically how you want to play. You have an overview of some of those KPIs that are important to you. So those key performance indicators around the way that you want to play and what a good performance looks like. So you've always got that in the background. And then I think, if you look at game day, you're obviously watching the game live, and you might be able to sort of clip little bits within the game that you might need to use afterwards, or maybe at half-time with the players. Because I think that's the ability that we've got nowadays, haven't we? Which I'm sure we'll come on to on the bench. But if you look, and then you might watch the game very quickly afterwards, maybe on the Saturday evening before you get back. If you're travelling back by train or whatever it is, you might end up watching the game back. You'd usually get a very brief statistical analysis of the game, just maybe like chunked down into quite simple form. Then often on the Sunday morning, you would get the GPS. So you get the physical data not long after the game. But on the Sunday morning, you'd have the physical data, you'd have the technical data. And then often, yourself, you'd provide a performance report that maybe would be even more detailed with some key. I think the key for me is, those observations that, let's say, you as head of performance, you make, because it's easy for a manager to get lots and lots of data. What you really want and you really value is key members of staff that can interpret that data around how you want to play and give you the points that you think we've maybe not done very well or need to improve on, or something that can then shape the week ahead. Because I think that's it. There's no point in having data if you're just going to read it, evaluate your game. Yeah, okay, we didn't do well enough. All right, great. Well, you know that anyway, usually by the performance or the scoreline. There's 2 very good KPIs for you ultimately. So you want something that's going to shape the rest of the week and the rest of the month and the games that are going to come, because it's all about patterns, isn't it? We look at it all the time, don't we? We look for patterns in the game, and we look for patterns around how we play. And if some of those numbers are dropping off, you need to improve on them. If some of those numbers are, you could be losing games, but those numbers are creeping up, and that actually, if you're patient, you're going to end up winning games and being in a better position. So look, I think you've got a better understanding of that really around, what data is important and, what type of things we would pull from the game, I think. So, what things would you look for in those reports, based around the data and what you might want to share back?
I think what's important is get context around how the performance was expected to go and then how it actually plays out. So I've always found great benefit of going into the meetings that happen before a game when the pre-analysis has been done and the game plan's been formed, because that gives me kind of already an outline of what I'm expecting the players are going to be asked to do. So whatever your game plan is, that tells me, okay, I'm going to expect potentially a quite explosive game, or I'm going to expect maybe something that isn't so explosive because we've chosen to play in a certain way. Or we're going to change formation, or certain players are going to play in a certain way, which is going to affect other players. So I think that's building the sketch of what we expect the game to look like. Then when the game happens, that's when all the kind of color is added to the performance. And of course, two teams playing for whatever it is, 100 minutes, is going to give us different demands. The scoreline's going to change. It could be weather dependent or whatever, which is going to then affect how the game plays out. So when I then get information back afterwards, it's right, taking all that knowledge of what I expected, knowing all of the players in the team, looking at underlying trends that we might have had. So traditionally we've kind of built our strength physically through a season, where we've tended to get a little bit stronger towards the end of the season as opposed to starting particularly fast. But knowing that kind of level is to come means that you can look at the early season kind of physical parameters or performances with that knowledge that, this is going to build. So I think that's always the case. You're always looking for the context around the performance and the outputs, because looked in isolation, they can tell you one thing about one game, but when you're looking over, say, 4, 6, 10 games, you can get a very different perspective as to what's happening.
I think that's important, isn't it? I think, because players, you could throw any data and any stat at a game or a player, and you can make it look either better or worse, depending on what you want the outcome to be. But I think actually, I think that's important, isn't it? Whatever you're asking the player to do, you have an overview of how you want to play. You have a slightly more condensed game plan around that specific game, and not maybe over the season. And then really, you have to use that data around what you've asked the player to do, don't you? Because if you've asked a player to, if you've said against the team that press high, look, we're going to maybe try and bypass that press a little bit earlier and drop it into the forward. So now all of a sudden we can bypass, a couple of units of the opposition and get into a great area with lots of space. You've then got to accept that their probably pass completion is not going to be as good. They're not going to make as many passes.
Yeah.
So again, there's some key elements around what you have to analyse after a game. And I think that's really, really important. I think that's why it's important that all of your staff understand the data's only the data, but it has to be shaped around the way you want to play, don't you? Because we've been into clubs, haven't we, where people have said, oh, this is how we work. And you've almost had to say, well, that's great, but this is how we work. And actually, maybe you need to shape the data around that. Or you're going into a club that knows how they want to play, and you've got to shape your data around that. I think either way, it doesn't matter, but there has to be a real clear definition of what you're measuring that analysis, that data against, doesn't there? And I think that's the crux of it, and that's the important thing.
I think what you make a great point there about understanding how a team plays, and you often see it, and I'm coming on to one of my bugbears here, but
here's with it.
When a team is declared as being not fit enough, say for a new manager, but when you look at the performances under a previous manager, you will say that they'll probably be around whatever that style of play was and how that manager wanted to play. And often you see that they try to shift that kind of physical stat quite quickly. So for example, you go from a low press team to somebody who wants to press high all over the pitch. That's a fundamental shift and a change for players, which is quite new for them and quite challenging for them. So even though certain numbers might be depressed in a certain style of play, you can also see in other styles of play, other numbers certainly come to the fore, but other ones may diminish off. So you could be a high explosive acceleration team, you suddenly become a counter-attacking team and you watch your sprint levels go through the roof. And there are different demands on players, but again, it's understanding how you use that information. There's always a story to be told in the data, whatever form of data, whether it's video, whether it's just statistics or it's GPS or whatever. And I think that's important, as you say, for coaches to understand that all of these sources of information build a picture. And certainly if they're on their game, they're looking at trends. And trends probably tell us more than just single game and single instances, because it's easy to see against a top team that you're going to have depressed possession, but against a weaker team, you're going to have lots more. That doesn't necessarily suit either team, does it? You know, when you have more or less possession than almost what your team's comfortable with.
Yeah, but it's also, as you well know, it's also a very easy narrative for a manager that's just gone into a club that maybe hasn't won the first few games to say, well, look, this team, you know, not fit enough to play the way I want them to play. But it's like anything, isn't it? We all know the tricks that people use, and you know, it never feels a good one, does it, when you've been the head of performance at the club previously? But I think
a little bit awkward.
But I think, but look again, you're right in as much as that. You know, when you look at the physical data, you know, if I look at the team over a period of time, and I'm not talking necessarily about situations we've had, but there might have been certain similarities. But if you're a team that you've worked out that your players in your squad and your team can't physically do certain or do things to the level that you want them to do, so you've shaped the game plan and you've shaped the way of playing around maybe being a little bit more conservative with the energy. If you're then a new manager coming in and you say, right, I want us to press all over the park, high intensity all the time, you might be able to do that for 20 minutes, but at 20 minutes, nobody's going to be able to do that for 90 minutes.
Yeah.
So then is it going to look like the team's not fit enough? Maybe it looks like actually the coach hasn't found the solution to the players' needs or the players' capabilities. So I think that's a challenge for any head coach manager, that you can play however you want to play, but you have to find the balance that the players can achieve. Otherwise, all you're going to do is you're going to lose games. So I think you're right. You've got to fit that data around how you want to play, and I think that's the important bit, isn't it? But and I think that's also a bit when you're a TV pundit and you're analysing a game. It's also very easy to throw XG around. It's also very easy to throw GPS stats around, and there's so much available to the TV now, isn't there, or the media in general, that, you know, there's always context there, isn't there? And I think it's only, I think it's easier to find that context when you're working in the club and you're working with the team and you'll work it and you know what you're trying to achieve. Whereas, you know, us pundits out there, it's very, very easy to critique whatever we want to try and look good.
Well, yeah, I mean, it pays the bills, I suppose. But when you're on the other side of it, when you're just having to wait for the result to actually happen and you're under pressure of it, then, you know, when you're live in games, you're trying to analyse it straight away, aren't you? You know, and as much as the people up in the commentary box are doing that, you're having to do it live, but with the pressure of obviously having the result to take care of and looking at your bench and decide who you change. What kind of information will you take on live in a game? Is it just what you see with your eyes? Are you relying on the coaches to analyse other things using other systems? How does that work?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're very fortunate now, aren't we? The last couple of years has probably been a slight shift in as much as what you're allowed on the bench. So, of course, you've got one screen that will be tied to the analysis, connected to the analysts in the stand, be connected to one of the coaches with an earpiece on. That's what you see on, you know, that's what the fans will see on the touchline. They'll go, whoa, I wonder what they're
That's
talking
those little
about.
tripods that we see.
The little tripod with a screen, and one of the coaches has always got an earpiece in, and so they're directly linked to the analysts. So there's the first bit where the manager might say, right, you know, can you get me a clip of us out of possession when the other team have got, you know, a little bit of build-up play from the two centre-halves or whatever that is? can you get me a few little pictures there of the space and how we're defending? They then go.
So you said there's no phones anymore going from like a director's box to the bench.
There's no corded phone, I don't believe, Dave, or a ex-car dealers that someone's got a good deal on would have holding the brick on us. Hello. So yeah, no, I don't believe so. Although COVID did provide a few challenges where we did one game in COVID. I digress slightly, but we did one game in COVID, and I was on the phone in the apartment because I wasn't at the game, and the assistant manager was getting handed the phone by someone on the bench, but I didn't actually realise they were walking to the touchline, handing him the phone, and it was like, you're thinking that's probably not as discreet as necessary, but essentially it's a communication. So now, you can ask the coach and say, could you get the lads to clip that? He can then speak to the analysts in the stand. They can clip it and maybe show him on the screen, send it down to the screen. You could maybe use it at halftime. So it's really, really interesting in a way that you can use it. Obviously, technology provides certain challenges in certain stadiums. Yeah. But I think it's a great way to maybe share the message to a player. You might be able to tell him, but he might not be able to really, truly understand it until he sees it on a TV or on an iPad. You can show them that at halftime. And you've got to be careful how you use it, of course. I think there's also the GPS stuff. So for example, you would have the physical stats and you'd be able to see how that plays out. I mean, share some of that information that you would feed back to me, because you would be able to give me some real context around the performance of the team and individuals, wouldn't you, on the GPS?
Well, one of my roles is obviously to look at, for example, the ebb and flow of the game, what the intensity of the game is like, how that relates to kind of our normative kind of performances, or is this a particularly hard start to a game, or is it quite an easy start to a game? And then as the game changes, through the aforementioned score lines or whatever's happened within the game, you could have a player getting sent off, or the opposition have changed formation and it's suddenly putting increased demand on certain players. We'll also be tracking that as well to say, look, this player is, overreaching, they're stressed in this kind of game. So it might be worth considering that if there is a substitution to be made, that this player is probably going to fatigue a little bit earlier than normal. So it might be a consideration where we've got more subs available to us now, but, when's the appropriate time to take that player out of the game and replace him with somebody fresher, just because of the nature of this game is he's not going to get through to the 95th or the 100th minute playing how he's being asked to play at the moment. The physical demands are too big. So I'll obviously try and give you a picture of the context of the game. And that's interesting sometimes, isn't it? Because I'll say, oh, look, this is a really intense game. And the coaching staff can look at you like, it doesn't feel like that.
No.
But that's not what the physical numbers are telling us from the GPS.
No, you're giving that objective data, aren't you? You're giving some context around it. It's up to me then to use that how I see fit to use it, isn't it? Or between us to make good decisions around players. Of course, you've got the third part of that, which is usually the medical team saying he can only play 60 minutes. So looking at it's 59 minutes, Gaffer, or it's 61 minutes. It's under pressure. And the player's looking over going, why am I playing extra minutes here? So, but you've got all sorts of information, haven't you, around, if you have got a player coming back from injury, what is a realistic capability for that player to reach? And, again, you're taking advice off the medical team around that, what's safe, what do we think is sensible. We're taking advice off the performance team yourself in what does a game look like. And sometimes you take a gamble and you think, we're 1-0 up, he might be fatiguing, but he's an experienced player that I think can make good decisions. And he might get that second win back. But I know that's not necessarily a technical term. But he might get that. He might feel a little bit better. He might have just been in a really high part of the game where he's had to work extra hard. And that's where now you need your Onana type goalkeeper to go down with supposed cramp at 60 minutes. Whose idea was that to get the goalkeeper to go down at 60 minutes?
Well, it's clever use of the laws, isn't it? You can't take the keeper off if they're injured. So, they're going down. And I think some teams have looked to manipulate that. But then I suppose that's another way of now, the analysis now, the game is going to go on to 100 minutes. So if you need to have a tactical break, right in the middle of the half, if you need to do that, you just select which player is, almost I know worth sacrificing, but you might take off a striker, or not take off a striker, but a striker might end up with a cramp, which just gives you time to maybe look at the game and decide around substitutions.
Head injury. Striker has to have some
striker head injury.
But you see those challenges, don't you, within the game, and sometimes there's opportunities tactically to get some information onto the players. There's opportunities physically where maybe you're under the cosh, you're under pressure. So there's a different type of challenge. You're under pressure, and you just need to break that up. And that's why you see managers throughout the land, and it'll never change, manipulating those situations to try to do that. But I think it's never going to change. You've got the information to hand, but it's always going to come down to using it the right way, using it effectively, sharing the information and the data to players, but in a contextual way. And I don't think that's ever going to necessarily change in football, but I think it's great to have it. I mean, I'd certainly rather have the information and have a challenge with how to effectively use it.
And do managers then have to upskill themselves in all of this stuff? Who teaches you all about doing your own video clipping and teaches you all about XG and that? Or is this something that's just infiltrated the game and it's part of like the learning of the modern coach, that they're expected to stay up to date with all of this?
I think you have to. I think the game moves, the game changes. The premise of the game and the parameters of the game don't change too much. But I think you have to be with those changes, don't you? If you don't understand the stats and what they mean, and how can you interpret a report? And if you can't interpret a report, yes, you've got good staff to do that for you. And I think that's very important, that you allow those staff to get their own findings on it and what they think and share that with you. But I think you also have to interpret that yourself. If you don't, then you might as well forget all of these advantages that you have, because they're all the marginal gains, Kaizen, little 1%ers that, can give you a slight advantage. We've found it, haven't we? It can help shape your week. It can help shape what you think, the game's going to become over the next 5 to 10 years. It can help shape, your training around, this is what the intensity and small blocks of the game look like from a GPS value. This is what it looks like from a technical value. And we can marry those two together and try to create training sessions that push the limits of that and push the boundaries of that. So I think you have to upskill yourself. I think if you can code yourself, or if you can clip and edit yourself, of course, that saves you having to then send all the timings that, of course, you once used to do. Often, even better, you get a member of staff that understand what you're looking for and how you want to play, and then can already add your context to it and already provide that information. That's absolute gold dust, and that's why obviously you have trusted staff, that because they understand what you want, and it's not what they want, it's what you want. It was a very different approach. So yeah, I think that's really important now. And a lot of clubs, that's probably why, different topic for us, but the director of football role now is to collate a lot of that information and try to shape that playing style, so that a manager comes in and you have that all in place, and that data from a 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the division the same, what the division looks like. So I think it's moving forward. I think it's changing. I think that, it will go down a route. I'm sure that AI will help with that along the way, which I'm sure we'll have another conversation about, because I know you've got a real interest in that also. But I think it's fascinating. I think it's exciting. I think that the analysis only adds to the information around it and shaping the game. But the game's always still the game, and it doesn't necessarily change it.
Yeah, I think we're just seeing people look through different lenses now, aren't we? Like some of the stuff we've been looking at over the last couple of months, coming out of Germany, like with packing data and things like this, where they've moved away from traditional tactical analysis and they're moving into this more dynamic, fluid analysis of the game, which is not necessarily about the technical output of whether a pass went from X to Y. It's how that pass took out opponents, or how many of your own team were affected by your misplaced pass. The wider kind of ecological expectation, or I suppose ecological effect of every action that happens in each game. That's just moving to a whole other new level, and I know it's something we're going to speak about in a specific podcast, but quite quickly. Like, how do you find some of those kind of new systems? I mean, there's something for us to learn about.
Yeah, I think there's things that we've looked at a little bit recently, haven't we, around some of that, and I think there's some systems out there that I think are fascinating to me as an ex-player and now a coach and manager. But you're speaking about it, like how many, what is a pass? Again, I go back to when I was first playing. A pass from me to you was a pass. It was either completed or not completed. And that would be measured the same as a pass that breaks lines, shall I say it? Breaking lines.
Good use of that term, yeah.
I love that term. That's absolutely incredible.
Great name for a
yeah, it's very, very transferable to football. But actually, I can make a pass 5 yards with no one around, or I can make a pass that actually splits and moves 5 defenders out the way and bypasses those defenders and puts a number 10 into a great position. And it's a very different value on that pass, but it would come across in the same way if you don't measure it in a different way. I think also some of the out of possession stuff's fascinating. I can intercept a pass and actually put myself in the same position, or the team in the same position as that fabulous bypass moment where I beat 3 or 4 players. So I think there's some really interesting stuff, and I'm excited to get into that further and dig a little bit deeper, because I think that's something that for me, it's far more contextual and exciting to learn about.
Well, I think we've put analysis to bed until, of course, the next game rolls around, and then we'll do it all again.
Absolutely. Let's just keep doing it. Let's keep analysing the game.
More analysis.
Analyse this, analyse that. Each and every moment of every game is hyper-analysed today. A player, coach and team can't do anything without it being dissected in the studio, on social media or elsewhere. It's come a long way from a single videotape and a chat with the manager. And as technology and data providers continue to become even more elaborate with their understanding of the game, have we lost the true essence of sport? Decisions are made, mistakes happen because humans play sport in the moment, yet the analysis takes place using supercomputers and slow motion replays. For the modern coach, they need to decide what and who is relevant as they look to build a winning team. Thanks for listening, and please subscribe to us on your podcast player or see the episode on our YouTube channel. Join us next time on Breaking Lines when we go behind the dressing room door once more.
I got a